About half the nitrogen atoms inside your body right now weren't made by a bird or a bean or a bolt of lightning. They were made in a factory. And the man who built that factory also invented modern chemical warfare. His name was Fritz Haber. You've probably never heard of him. That's strange, because he's arguably the most consequential chemist who ever lived. More than half the food eaten on this planet exists because of what he did in a laboratory in 1909, and thousands of soldiers died in the mud of Belgium in 1915 because of what he did 6 years later. Same man, same element, two directions. Here's the question that will run underneath everything we're about to look at. How does one discovery, made by one person, end up feeding roughly 4 billion human beings and at the same time sitting at the origin of 2 world wars, the Holocaust's gas chambers, and the largest disruption of a planetary chemical cycle in Earth's history? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's a straight description of what happened, and it happened inside a single human life in less than 3 decades, mostly in one country, mostly in one man's head. The story of nitrogen isn't really the story of a molecule. It's the story of a bargain nobody sat down to sign, but that every person alive today has already inherited. Let's go find it. Start with the air itself. Look up. Take a breath. Roughly 78% of what just went into your lungs was nitrogen gas. It's the most abundant thing in the atmosphere. It's everywhere. It's free. And for almost all of human history, it might as well have been on the moon, because nitrogen in the air comes bound up in pairs. 2 nitrogen atoms lock to each other by one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature. Plants can't touch it. Animals can't touch it. Most life on Earth has, quite literally, been starving inside a room full of food it couldn't open. There were only 2 natural keys. One was a small family of bacteria that live in the roots of beans and clover. They can crack the bond and pull nitrogen out of the air, slowly. The other was lightning. When a bolt of lightning tears through the atmosphere, the temperature spikes so high that the pair breaks, and nitrogen combines with oxygen. The rain washes it into the soil. That was the whole budget. For billions of years, that was the entire supply. Now stack the 19th century on top of that. Cities are exploding. Population is climbing at a rate no civilization had ever seen. Farmland is running out of nitrogen faster than the bacteria, and the lightning can replace it. European agriculture is being kept alive by 2 things: bird droppings, shipped in from islands off the coast of Peru, and a strange white salt dug out of the driest desert on Earth in northern Chile. Wars were fought over both. Fortunes were made and broken. But by the end of the century, chemists were doing the math and coming to the same alarming conclusion. The world's fixed nitrogen was running out. And when it ran out, hundreds of millions of people were going to starve. Into that room walks a young German Jewish chemist, ambitious, patriotic, socially anxious, brilliant in a way his colleagues found almost intimidating. And he starts thinking about how to reach into the air and pull nitrogen down by force. Fritz Haber was born in 1868 in Breslau, in what's now Poland. His family was well off, Jewish, deeply German in the way many assimilated German Jews were in that period, proud of the country, proud of the language, proud of the culture, prouder of Germany in some cases than Germans themselves. He converted to Christianity at some point in his 20s. He wanted to belong. He wanted more than anything to be useful. By 1904, he was at the University of Karlsruhe, wrestling with the nitrogen problem full-time. His rival, Walter Nernst, told him the equations wouldn't work. The reaction was too slow, the pressures too extreme, the yields too small. Haber took that as a challenge. In 1909, he did it. He built a tabletop apparatus, less than a meter tall, that took nitrogen out of the air and pushed it, drop by drop, into liquid ammonia. At the top, invisible gas. At the bottom, a colorless liquid that could feed a crop. It looked like magic. In a way, it was. But a tabletop miracle isn't a fertilizer industry. To go from cups of ammonia to trainloads of it, you needed pressure vessels no one had ever built, catalysts no one had ever tested, and a factory design that didn't exist. That job went to an engineer at the chemical giant BASF named Karl Bosch. By September 1913, in a small German town called Oppau, Bosch had the first industrial ammonia plant in the world running. This was the birth of what came to be called the Haber-Bosch process. More than a century later, it's still one of the largest single chemical processes on the planet. The year Oppau came online, Europe was less than a year away from a war, and that fact would change what happened next. Here's the first surprise. Ammonia doesn't just become fertilizer. Run it through the right steps and it becomes nitric acid. Run nitric acid through the right steps and you get TNT. You get the propellant inside a rifle cartridge. You get the payload of an artillery shell. The same molecule that grows the wheat also blows up the trench. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, the British Royal Navy blockaded Germany within weeks. The German army had been counting on the same Chilean saltpeter that everyone else had been counting on. That supply was suddenly cut off. By any reasonable military estimate, the German army should have run out of ammunition by 1915 or 1916. The war might have ended 2 full years earlier than it did. It didn't. Because the ammonia plant at Oppau and the ones that were rapidly built alongside it kept the German war machine breathing. Historians of the period are unusually direct about this. The industrial fixation of nitrogen, Haber's process, Bosch's engineering, prolonged the First World War, millions of extra shells, 2 extra years of trenches. Every casualty of that stretch, on every side, exists partly because of what came out of that laboratory in Karlsruhe. And Haber himself didn't stop there. By the fall of 1914, he had turned his research institute in Berlin into what was, in effect, a wing of the German army. He was in uniform. He was smoking cigars at planning meetings, and he was working on something else entirely. He wanted a new kind of weapon. The stalemate in the trenches had made both sides desperate. Haber's proposal was almost surgical in its cruelty. Release a heavy poison gas from cylinders under the right wind, and let the wind carry it invisibly and quietly into the enemy's trenches. He picked chlorine. It was cheap. It was plentiful. It was heavier than air, which meant it would sink into the trench floors where soldiers were sheltering. April 22nd, 1915, Ypres, Belgium. He was there in person. Nearly 6,000 steel cylinders had been buried along a 4-mile stretch of the German front line. That afternoon, the wind finally turned. The valves were opened. More than 160 tons of chlorine drifted out over no man's land as a low yellow-green wall. Soldiers described it later as looking like a slow, sickly cloud rolling across the ground. Canadian and French colonial troops on the other side had nothing to breathe through except their own handkerchiefs. In a single afternoon, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 men died by suffocation. Thousands more collapsed and didn't recover. This was the first successful mass chemical weapons attack in history. Fritz Haber was on the field, watching it happen. He was promoted to captain within weeks. Now, the second surprise, and this one, most tellings of the story tend to skip over. Fritz Haber's wife was also a chemist. Her name was Clara Immerwahr. She was, in fact, the first woman in Germany to receive a doctorate in chemistry. That was in 1900, a decade and a half before Ypres. It was an achievement that, in the Germany of that time, was not just rare but almost inconceivable. She had married Fritz in 1901. She had watched him climb, and she had watched him grow more distant. And she had watched, with mounting horror, as he threw the whole weight of his laboratory behind the war effort. She was a pacifist. She called his work on chemical weapons a perversion of the ideals of science. And she said so out loud, publicly. She begged him to stop. He accused her of treason. On the night of May 1st, 1915, a little over a week after Ypres, Haber returned to Berlin, where a party was thrown in his honor. That night, in the garden of their home, Clara took her own life using her husband's own army revolver. Their 13-year-old son found her. She died the next morning. Fritz Haber left for the Eastern Front later that same day to supervise another gas attack, this time against Russian troops. He never spoke publicly, for the rest of his life, about her death. 3 years later, in 1918, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the synthesis of ammonia. Several prominent chemists refused to attend the ceremony. Haber accepted the prize. He also, in the meantime, worked out a mathematical formula that came to be called Haber's rule. In essence, it describes how a low dose of a poison gas over a long exposure will kill you just as reliably as a high dose over a short one. It's still cited in toxicology textbooks. It was originally developed to make chemical weapons more efficient. The pattern here isn't really a paradox. That's the word people usually reach for. But paradox implies a mystery you can't unpack. Haber's life is not a mystery. It's a very clear, very human sequence of decisions made by a man who kept believing that whatever he built would end up serving his country. Every one of those beliefs turned out to be wrong, but he didn't live long enough to see the worst of it. In the 1920s, Haber's Institute helped develop a pesticide. It was a cyanide-based fumigant sold under the trade name Zyklon A. It was designed to kill insects in grain stores. It included an odor additive as a safety warning. In the 1930s, a new version came out. Same underlying chemistry, minus the warning smell. That version was called Zyklon B. In 1933, the Nazi regime took power in Germany. Haber, decorated veteran, Nobel laureate, converted Christian, patriotic to the point of self-erasure, was suddenly in the new language of the state, Haber the Jew. He was told to fire his Jewish staff. He refused. He resigned. He was in his 60s, in poor health, and had nowhere to go. He wandered across Europe looking for a laboratory that would take him. Chaim Weizmann, the chemist who would later become the first president of Israel, invited him to Palestine to help run a new research institute. Haber agreed. He never got there. On January 29, 1934, in a hotel room in Basel, Switzerland, on his way south, Fritz Haber died of heart failure. He was 65. 5 years after his death, the Second World War began. Zyklon B, the pesticide descended from work done at Haber's own institute, was used in the gas chambers of the Nazi concentration camps to kill more than 1 million Jews. Among the victims were members of Haber's own extended family. His half-sister's daughter, Hilda Glucksmann, her husband, their 2 children. The chemistry Fritz Haber built to feed Germany was used to murder his people in a country he'd spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged to. That's where most tellings of his story end. It's the darkest note, and it feels like a closing chord. But it's not the end of the nitrogen story, because the nitrogen story didn't die with him. Today, more than a century after Opal opened, the Haber-Bosch process is still running, everywhere, all the time. About 90 million tons of synthetic ammonia are made every year. Roughly 80% of it becomes fertilizer. The best estimates today, from researchers at Cornell and from the group at Our World in Data, put it this way. About half the population of the planet, 3.5 to 4 billion people, is fed by food grown with synthetic nitrogen. Roughly half of the nitrogen atoms in the protein of your body traveled through a Haber-Bosch reactor at some point before they reached you. That is not a metaphor. That is a physical fact about the atoms that build your muscles and your brain. And here's the third surprise. The same process is now, by a considerable margin, one of the most disruptive things human beings have ever done to the planet. Scientists studying what they call planetary boundaries, the safe operating limits for the Earth's chemical systems, set the safe ceiling for human nitrogen input at about 62 million tons per year. Current human input is roughly 160 million tons per year. We are running the nitrogen cycle at nearly 3 times the rate the planet can absorb. The excess doesn't disappear. It runs off farms into rivers. It flows down watersheds into estuaries. In the Gulf of Mexico, in the Baltic Sea, in the Yangtze Delta, it feeds massive algae blooms that, when they die, strip the oxygen out of the water. Fish suffocate. Whole stretches of ocean turn into what marine biologists now bluntly call dead zones. There are more than 400 of them worldwide. Some of the nitrogen leaves as gas. Nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas roughly 270 times more warming than carbon dioxide, molecule for molecule, over a century. The same reaction that keeps half the world alive is quietly rewriting one of the oldest chemical cycles on Earth. Fritz Haber never saw any of this coming. Neither did Carl Bosch. Neither did most of the people who scaled the industry up in the 20th century. They were solving a starvation problem. They solved it. The bill is being paid by a different set of people in a different century. So, what do you do with that? Not much. In the direct, hands-on sense, you are not going to shut down the Haber-Bosch process. Nobody is. Without it, the food system of the planet collapses inside a growing season. The math is not close. But you can do one small thing that, oddly, turns out to matter more than it looks. You can carry the whole story in your head at the same time. Most stories, when you read them, want to close cleanly. Hero or villain. Gift or debt. Progress or ruin. Fritz Haber's life is a straight refusal of that. Every good thing he did was also a bad thing, and every bad thing he did emerged from something he thought was good. The nitrogen story is exactly the same, just scaled up. The next time you eat a slice of bread, or a piece of cheese, or a leaf of anything green, you're eating a decision that was made, on paper, in Karlsruhe in 1909. You're eating a debt that runs from Ypres in 1915 to a gulf of dead water off the coast of Louisiana in the 21st century. You're also eating the reason your grandparents didn't starve. All of that is the same fact. That's the perspective the story is trying to hand you. You keep it, and every headline about fertilizer runoff or ammonia prices or food shortages starts reading differently. Not as isolated events, but as episodes inside a single, long, unfinished bargain. About half the nitrogen atoms inside your body right now were made in a factory. The man who built that factory saved billions of lives from a starvation that was, by every serious estimate at the time, coming for them. The same man watched a yellow-green cloud roll across a Belgian field in 1915 and helped kill thousands of soldiers in an afternoon. His wife, one of the first women in the world to hold a doctorate in chemistry, took her own life in protest of what he was doing. His family, decades after his death, was murdered with a chemical descended from his own institute. The process he invented feeds roughly 4 billion people today, and it is at the same time cracking the Earth's nitrogen cycle in ways that scientists now describe as one of the most severely breached planetary limits on the map. One man, one element, two histories folded into each other so tightly that you can no longer pull them apart. You've spent the last 10 minutes with the full story. Most people never do. Most people know about the fertilizer or they know about the gas, but they don't know the two belong to the same sentence. Now you do. And you can never quite look at a loaf of bread the same way again.